Good afternoon. My name is Stacy Dobbin, and I am presenting a research project I did for University of Montana Western Special Education Course 434. Vicki Howard is the instructor. The subject I decided to research was time on task for a student with autism who exhibits aggressive and elopement behaviors when requested to complete unpreferred tasks. The purpose of the study was to determine if tangible reinforcement of edibles or a preferred activity would motivate the student to stay on task to complete teacher-requested activities. And the student only wanted to work with one educator in the classroom and would exhibit aggression and elopement behaviors when given a direction from other educators than the lead teacher. The student is actually a 9-year-old elementary school student diagnosed with ASD, and he has moderate to moderate intellectual disabilities. He also has deficits in social and emotional development as well as verbal communication. He's considered a nonverbal student. The student attends 3rd grade in a special education self-contained classroom in central Montana. The classroom is a structured systems classroom, which follows along the area of the teach system. The subject exhibits inappropriate behaviors when required to complete academic and non-preferred tasks and asked to complete tasks by non-preferred educators. I used a changing criteria single subject research design. The student was given a plus on top of a visual reinforcer of 5 smiley faces on a laminated sheet for on-task behavior, and when he would get the required number of smiley faces on the task behavior sheet, he would be given a preferred edible or a preferred activity. We collected intervention data for 10 days and in 10-minute increments and documented that information on ABC event recording and the task sheet. I had to explain to the classroom educators what time on task looked like so that we all were using our eyes to document the same behaviors. And it's very, very important for students to have on-task behavior and be able to sit and complete their work in the educational setting. Of course, all students can become distracted, and students diagnosed with learning disabilities are at a higher level of distraction in the classroom and other academic settings. Students at higher risk of off-task behavior due to a diagnosed disability might have difficulties with information processing of materials, comprehension, generalization, and this affects the student's ability to remain on task and to retain that information and generalize that information. The intervention was cost effective and would be easy to reproduce. As I said, the time on task study would be able to reproduce, and according to researchers, Students are responsible for monitoring their own behavior, and once they're able to monitor their own behavior, um, they are more successful and are able to maintain the information and generalize that information across settings. Okay, now we're going to this method, the subject and setting. Like I said, the child is a 9-year-old male student who attended 3rd grade in a self-contained structured systems classroom that follows the TEACH system. He attends part days. The student has been diagnosed with autism and developmental delays. The student is considered nonverbal and utilizes a picture schedule throughout the school day and a mini picture schedule when attending specials such as music, physical education, counseling, and library. In place also was a token system where the student would receive a token for appropriate behaviors such as following a direction within 7 to 10 seconds. He'd get 2 tokens for working with somebody other than the classroom teacher because he has such a hard time working with others. The visual schedule and the token worked well for the first 3 months of school, and so that's what made me decide that I would like to try the time on task to try and get him to complete some of his work and decrease elopement and aggressive episodes. Now we're switching to the next one, which explains about the daily visual schedule and the tokens. The student would also receive a token for checking his schedule right away. A lot of times he would go to his schedule and update it and then elope to another area, preferred area such as play or over to the sink to get some water. The student loves everything Dory and loves water play. Okay. During the first 3 days of baseline, the student was observed while completing academic reading and math and independent work. When he's happy, will do and content will do any kind of work that you request of him. However, when he is not happy or content, any academic or non-preferred task would set him off and he would explode, exhibit inappropriate behaviors such as throwing chairs, tearing up classroom materials. He would ignore any requests from the educators. And more often than not, he actually did exhibit aggressive behaviors in various forms. Okay, next slide. The purpose of the study was to determine if the tangible reinforcers such as edibles, candy, or a preferred item or activity like Dory or Nemo or water play following his academic reading, math, and independent desk work would increase the student's time on task, which would result in him actually completing his required work. The dependent variable was time on task during academic reading, math, and independent desk rotations without elopement or aggression. The on-task behavior would be to complete the work, but it also would be remaining in the designated area until the visual timer sounded and let everybody know that it was time to check schedule and change rotation. On here I have also a explanation of what aggression is, and the reason why I have it listed out the way it is because this was all of the types of behavior that were being exhibited that we are trying to minimize, any contact with staff or peers or trying to hurt them, causing a red mark, a bruise, or making staff or other students cry out. This also included attempts that are dodged, blocked, or physically redirected. The student would become at times so aggressive that he would pick up furniture and throw it at staff and peers and impede the safety of himself and others. The dependent measure of the dependent variable. The dependent variable was receiving plus marks or negative marks, a plus or a negative, on top of the smiley face based on the student completing material, being on task or off task. If the student was on task, he would mark a smiley face on the face of the smiley, and then move to the next task and do the same. If the student was not on task, he would put a minus on the smiley face. We required the student to only receive one smiley face through the first week to practice, and he received the smiley face the first day on a non-preferred activity. Figure 1, this is the actual sheet that we used, and the student would put a plus or a minus on the first smiley face based on whether or not he finished his. Is the measurement of the dependent variable is the ABC analysis time on task that we tracked his time on task with during the baseline and during treatment. As you can see, it's a generic ABC form, and it worked perfectly. The materials are used for the study were just on-task recording sheets, and we just created them off of the computer. Needed a laminator, laminated materials to produce figure 1, and then just printed off ABC on task documentation forms from the printer. The research design, of course, was a single subject, and it was a changing criteria design, and it was used across the study to evaluate the effectiveness of the on-task procedure we were implementing in eliminating inappropriate off-task behavior. The baseline was collected for 3 days. I used the ABC data form that was in figure 2, and followed by the implementation of the on-task tracking forms, figure 1. So during baseline, the student was given direction on how to utilize the on-task smiley face data sheet. The student was shown the card, and I shared with him how he should mark the time on task and document to show that he was indeed on task and working towards the edible or the preferred item. So the student was required to attain during baseline 1 plus sign for the first week of introduction of the treatment time, and which was actually just 20%. During baseline, I and the other teachers would see that the student would be interested in the smiley face, constantly looking up at it and seeing if we had marked anything. And if the student during baseline was off task during reading, math, or his independent work, um, all educators in the classroom would positively redirect the student back to the task at hand by stating, are you on task, TE? And when TE did earn his mark, he received the opportunity to pick one edible, out of two choices. Everybody likes to have a choice. The independent variable. After baseline, we required that the student do self-monitoring procedures. We wanted him to start marking the plus and the negatives on his on-task smiley sheet, just because it means so much more to the student when we involve them as much as we can in their education. I talk about the reading, the math, and the independent workstations, and at each area, the student is required to complete 3 tasks at each station or rotation. And we particularly just monitored on-task behavior since his days were so short. At breakfast, morning academic reading, math, and independent desk rotations. So for baseline, we conducted ABC analysis for 3 days. When the baseline did show a positive trend, then we introduced the treatment. And the subject was briefed on how to utilize the on-task behavior sheet with the 5 smiley faces, and that he only needed the first week to receive 1 out of 5 to receive the preferred item or activity in the first phase of treatment. When the student achieved the plus occurrence 2 consecutive days in a row, then the next phase of treatment did. Again, the type of treatment we were using, or the type of research design I was using, was the changing criteria design. So during the first phase of treatment, the student did receive his 20%, which was requirement for 1 plus sign on a smiley face. In the second phase, he received 2 on tasks, which brought that up to 40%. So the 2 out of 5 was 40%. In the third phase of treatment, the student was on task. It stabilized to 60%. And then the subject maintained on-task behavior at 72% for stage 4. During stage 4, because the student was doing so well with his on-task behavior, I changed it up to require the student to actually decide if he wanted a edible or if he would have liked a preferred activity when it was time for the reinforcement. The student maintained 4 on-task symbols, resulting in 72 across 2 consecutive weeks. As the changing criteria design was used, we don't return to baseline. The stabilization of the occurrence of time on task illustrated that the behavior was going to be sustained. So as I was saying, the baseline illustrates the behavior to be sustained, so the hypothesis of the reinforcers being a motivator for the student to stay on task was true. Inter-observer agreement. As the researcher and the classroom teacher, I provided extensive training to the paras to decipher what on-task and off-task behavior looked like, so that we were collecting accurate and meaningful data. We did checks every third task. I also conducted constant inter-observer agreement calculations. If the paras observed 4 instances of time on task behaviors in a 10-minute session, and then I observed 5, then we had a 0.80, and if you multiply that 0.8, if you multiply that by 100, we had 80%, and the rest of them actually ended up being 100%. The social validation. At the conclusion of this research project, the mother, the student, and the other classroom educators were interviewed. The mother was interviewed, and she was very happy that her student was having less struggles at school, but she shared that she is still having many struggles at home. The student still does not want to bathe at home, has issues with toileting at home, and so I see that we can actually extend some of this research later after Christmas and get together with Mom and figure out how we can support her with on-task behavior when she requests it. So when I interviewed the subject, he liked smiley faces, he told me, and he really liked getting the candy. The M&Ms and Skittles were huge motivators, and towards the end I also purchased Swedish fish because he really likes fish, and he did respond to the Swedish fish as an edible, a preferred edible. The results of my research, I knew that students like to be have say in their education. This student seemed to really respond when he was able to decide what materials he was going to do and in what order. He chose to complete his work. I think that really helped with his on-task behavior, because he was able to choose out of 4 items. He had to pick 3 that he was going to complete, and he was able to choose the order in that he completed the materials. Towards the end of this research study, the student was transitioning independently. He was not running off. or eloping into other areas that he was not supposed to be in. This is the results continued. This is graph 1. And as you can see, baseline, and then self-recording, edible reinforcers, and play. And these are the goals. I got my performance, so many sessions, and the opportunities, 7 across the board. Let's see, the data in figure 3, day 2, shows that the student did increase to earn 2 marks out of the 7. And the third work session, he maintained 3 out of 7. And phase 4, he ended up getting, as you can see in figure 4, when I moved it over to where he had to decide between play or preferred edible. Both were so very reinforcing to him. The inter-observer reliability was calculated every day during our study, and the time on task was easy to observe because when the student wasn't on task, he would exhibit aggressive behavior, or he was eloping out of the classroom or into another area of the classroom or into another area of the data. And then when we compared the classroom data, it was 100%. The tangible reinforcer was a preferred edible or an activity that was effective in supporting the student, and it increased his time on task. A couple things that we noticed is the more that the student stayed on task, it seemed the more self-esteem he gained, and his mood was so regulated, and he was just even across the board for the days. Also, his aggressive episodes used to be 10 or more a week, as high as 30 in a day, and the aggression actually had decreased to 1 to 2 episodes a day. Another thing that was so important is how the classroom educators or the paras understood that when the students are giving opportunities to make choices where their education is concerned, there is more buy-in and the student is more likely to be on task. And these are the references. Thank you very much. I will listen to questions momentarily.